Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. The United States has again threatened to withdraw support from Ukraine if a peace deal isn't done. So what happens if Donald Trump walks away?
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
for interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The United States is losing patience with Ukraine. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, just the latest to say that America will walk away if the two warring sides don't sign up to its plan. His boss, Donald Trump, he claims a deal is close. The problem in his eyes is Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Seems like Ukraine's president is unwilling to hand over bits of his country to those that have invaded it. And he does have support from Europe, including the UK.
Russia is the aggressor here, and that is being felt by the Ukrainians as it's been felt for 3 long years now, and that's why it's important that we get Russia to an unconditional ceasefire.
Dominic Waghorn, our international affairs editor, is here. Dominic, look, first things first, it is possible, isn't it? We are now living in a world where the United States might entirely withdraw its support from an ally that's been invaded by Russia.
I mean, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
I think, until
it really
January,
does.
it would have seemed completely beyond imagination. But I think we are at the point where we're asking if it's possible. With the caveat that Donald Trump is a negotiator, he thinks he's a deal maker. And in the same way as if you want a carpet, you might walk out of the shop a few times. He may be doing that here. But his patience does seem to be wearing thin. I think, to understand where we might be, I think we have to get inside the mind of Donald Trump if we can. It's always psychology over policy when you're looking at Donald Trump. And, what's crucial to understanding Donald Trump is his binary worldview. Effectively, he sees the world as divided into the strong and the weak. And this is, it's essential to grasp this if you want to work out what Donald Trump might do next. And he seems to see the role of the strong as to dominate, as to prevail, to exert their will. And conversely, the role of the weak is to roll over and to accept their fate. With Ukraine, it's Ukraine's fault it got invaded because it's weak. It should have done more to become strong. It should have seen the threat. It should have found a way around it. And because it got invaded, it's now its responsibility to put up with it. And therefore, he seems to think that Ukraine needs to do more to make peace happen than Russia. And he's not happy with what Ukraine has given so far, which is a lot, but it's not enough as far as he's concerned. And if he doesn't get what he needs from Ukraine, he seems to be saying at the moment he is prepared to walk away. What that means isn't clear, but, he's prepared to walk away.
Does that then explain why we are now hearing from the White House, directly from the president himself, this is not my fault? Look, there is a deal on the table, but it's Zelenskyy's fault. It's Europe's fault. It's anyone else's fault but mine. Ignoring the fact, of course, that what he is asking of Ukraine is something that Ukraine doesn't want. We've heard from Britain. It doesn't think it's right. And the other members of the Quad, France, Germany, they don't agree with it either.
Yeah, exactly. We seem to be heading towards a collision, which seems to be inevitable and rather inexorable, the sort of momentum towards it. And that's a collision between the way Donald Trump sees the world or wants the world to be and the way Ukrainians see it and the way Europeans see it as well. And for the Europeans and the Ukrainians, what the American peace plan, if you can call it that, is effectively capitulation.
Yeah, 100%.
From Ukraine yesterday, saying, if we had known that what was required of us was to surrender, to cede sovereignty of Crimea to the Russians, to accept that the Russians can take by force what they've taken by force, and that we can't join NATO, then there would have been no point to negotiations. And the point is, it's not just surrender, it's they see Putin as an aggressor who has to be deterred, and when he's not deterred, he goes on to carry out more aggression. So, and then if he's allowed to take chunks of Ukraine, he'll continue doing more of that in Ukraine eventually, once he's got his strength back, potentially in Europe as well. So it's a question of principles, but also a question of security in Europe. Now, Donald Trump doesn't see it that way. He sees Ukrainian intransigence not accepting their weak role, and he sees that as a block to what he really wants, which is the glory of a deal that he can do quickly, that he promised he'd do within 24 hours, now seems to think it's going to take 100 days.
If the American proposed peace deal that's on the table is agreed to, that is a win for Russia. They gain territory. If America walks away from this peace process, if Russia is not punished for what it has done, that is a win for Russia.
Yes, and it's a win for any aggressor. That's a principle that has been blocked and opposed since the Second World War, and that position has strengthened global security. Then the question that we've been asking since January, we can begin to answer in ways which are really troubling for the world, which is America about to end its role as guarantor of international security, or certainly security in Europe? And all the signs from what J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, and Trump have been saying rhetorically are, yes, eventually, at some point during this presidency, that is looking increasingly likely. And that's something the Europeans have been, in public at least, unable or unwilling to directly answer. They have hoped to give Trump the benefit of the doubt. They hope that they can persuade the Americans to stay on side and guarantee international security. If that doesn't happen, the Europeans have to step up to the plate.
Isn't it more fundamental than whether or not America provides security guarantees? Isn't it whether or not the United States is our ally? Because the reason for the close relationship which is enjoyed, and the reason that it has air bases, military bases dotted around the world with its allies, is because of the nature of the relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, totally. So in public, they're having to continue giving Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. If you say to people like Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, is it not time to accept that America's not the partner it was? He would say, as he said to me, it's too early to say that. We have to just see where it goes. Mark Carney, the new sort of leader to be in Canada, seems to think it is time to say, what we've known as our relationship with America is now over. The unthinkable is now being thought, but we're not there yet, I think, in accepting that, because it's such a grim prospect, losing America as a reliable partner. But if you think about the ideology around Donald Trump, he's surrounded by people who have had more in common with Vladimir Putin than with Europe. They see Putin as a kind of fellow warrior in the culture wars. They've been fighting for decades on issues like gender, homosexual rights, on family, on Christianity, on migration, and on race. And they see him as a kind of a bulwark against the kind of decadent decline that they've been fighting in a sort of pagan West. And it's been on the fringe of American far-right politics for decades. But those voices are now in the White House. They're influencing foreign policy. Some of those ideas we've heard articulated by people like J.D. Vance. That is the kind of world we live in now, where the American presidents and the vice presidents, they seem to feel they have more in common with the Russian president than they do with their European allies. And that is a reality, I think, their allies in Europe are still not fully awakened to.
Let's park perhaps the more esoteric and longer-term questions for a second and deal with the practicalities of US withdrawal from this peace process. I mean, first and foremost, can Ukraine continue to fight this war without US support?
If you remember back in last year, for about 6 months, the American support dried up. It was cancelled and the Ukrainian army didn't collapse. Had you asked that question a couple of years ago, unlikely that Ukraine could have held its own for that long. But the Ukrainian military is kind of morphing into a fighting force that depends a lot more on drones. It doesn't really need American support for drones.
What of US intelligence? I mean, it still needs that.
It does need US intelligence, but it's getting European intelligence as well.
Okay.
Most experts seem to think there's enough gas in the tank in terms of the support America's already pledged and that's on its way to Ukraine to last for several more months. And its adversaries have various weaknesses. What the Russians have been unable to do is overwhelm the enemy, despite the fact they have enormous advantages in terms of numbers, both in terms of artillery, shells, materiel, and men. They've not been able to use that as leverage to punch through the Ukrainian line. And it's questionable whether they could be able to do so, certainly not for the next 6 months or so.
They're straining at the seams. We're approaching 1 million Russians injured or killed on Ukrainian battlefields. The longer this conflict goes on, the more those sanctions bite, the more difficult it becomes for Russia to prosecute this war. And this is the point at which the Americans decide, you know what, time to take our toys and go home.
So yeah, there are enormous strains on the Russian side. On the other hand, the Russians have totalitarian control of the media. They seem able to suppress any dissent. I think, if they were to try and mobilize a lot more men, that might be problematic. But for now, they seem to be okay. So we're kind of at a stalemate. It doesn't look as though a full American withdrawal of support would change that fundamentally for at least half a year. I think beyond that, it's a question of political will. Europe is 10 times economically stronger than Russia. It is far more advanced militarily. Combined together, it could give the Ukrainians the support that would allow them to hold off the Russian threat for as long as it takes for those forces, as you say, on the Russian side to be brought to bear to eventually force Putin to end the war. But the question is, does Europe have that political will? Does it have the unity? Does it have the ability to make the sacrifices? Because in terms of public spending, economic sacrifice, the kind of sacrifices required for Europe to give the Ukrainians the resources they need long term, I think there's a big question mark about that.
And whilst we're sitting in our European capitals asking all of these questions, the United States is engaged in bilateral talks with the Russians about a trade deal.
Yeah. When you see Stephen Witkoff, the Trump negotiator, talking about Vladimir Putin going to the church, praying for Trump, without any sense that he's dealing with a former KGB agent, that ties into the psychology, as I say, of Donald Trump's worldview. Mm-hmm. It's the people around him aren't prepared to do the legwork to grapple with this problem. They're more prepared to tell the president what he wants to hear. Yeah.
So we are talking about a world in which Russia could continue with its war with Ukraine at a point where the United States is a de facto ally of Russia.
Certainly diplomatically. The American diplomats voted on the Russian side in the UN. And in what the Americans are saying, they do seem to be more and more on the side of the Kremlin. But I think the question here is, when Trump says he wants to walk away, is it in the same way that he walked away from Kim Jong-un? You remember the bromance he had with the North Korean leader that began very promisingly. He ran into the reality of the realpolitik of dealing with a very wily operation on the world stage, and he kind of tired of it. Is Donald Trump just simply going to tire of this and walk away thinking, I gave it a go, I gave it the best I could, and if they don't want to have peace, then that's their problem? Or is he going to actually then help Russia? He may just give up on this process and let the status quo continue, or he may then pull away American military support. I don't think that's clear yet.
But if he does get bored, if he does withdraw support, the suggestion from our colleague, Professor Michael Clark, on the podcast yesterday was that he turns his attention to Iran. Certainly we know that he's already got some of his focus on Iran and the potential deal pressurising them into some sort of concessions.
I think, it's not sort of unfair to Donald Trump to say that he wants the shiny, exciting things out of this presidential career. He wants a legacy, and he sees himself as a deal maker, and he wants to do a deal that's going to win him a Nobel Peace Prize. He has this, whether he's a narcissist or not, he has a very inflated sense of his own ability and his own worth, and he seems to believe that that is something that he can achieve. Iran is arguably an even thornier problem for him to grapple with. But he sees, again, in very simple terms, he sees the Iranians having great potential, great economic potential. He sees the regime as weak, and he has people around him telling this regime is far more rotten than I think it is, having been there recently, and saying to him that, if he puts enough pressure on the Iranians, they will crumble, they will give up their nuclear program. And then, deals can be done with the Iranians that open it up economically and the Iranian people get richer. That would be quite bad news for the regime. So I think it's unlikely the Ayatollahs are going to go for that. But that's certainly the view that Donald Trump and the people around him seem to have. And therefore, he sees an opening there and an opportunity. But, it's the same problem as he had with the Russians. The negotiators he's arrayed against the Russians are not really up to the ability of the Russian diplomats, who are extremely seasoned, very experienced, wily negotiators. The Iranians are very good negotiators as well. And up against them, he has Steve Witkoff, who made a lot of money as a real estate lawyer, but is not sort of trained as a diplomat, doesn't seem to have the geopolitical wiles to deal with either the Iranians or the Russians, it seems.
We have a picture of a world that is fracturing right now. When things calm down and when those bits of the world start to coalesce again, we will be looking at a different power structure, won't we?
That's absolutely true. I think, even if Donald Trump was to go back to a kind of neoliberal orthodox president,
not putting money on it
so far today, a lot of damage has been done. As someone said, it's not so much a sense of sort of political collapse, it's a sense of cultural collapse in America. If Donald Trump, continues for the next 4 years, there's no guarantee he won't be replaced by someone else who is equally unorthodox and unconventional, because that's what Americans seem to want to vote for whatever reason. So yes, that in terms of the way the world views America, I think we have forever changed the way we see America as this reliable partner that has supported international security and being a guarantor of it. But I think a lot depends on Europe. Europe can do a lot more to replace that vacuum and has the potential to do so economically. It's a question of political will and a question of whether the leaders in Europe are prepared to get together and fill that vacuum until another American president comes along who can go back to the old ways, if that's at all possible, or whether we're looking at a fundamentally, completely altered world. That's certainly the way we're heading at the moment. But I don't think the cause is lost completely. A lot really does rely now on what Europe does next.
Dominic, many thanks.
Thank you.
And to find out what position the United States has taken on Ukraine this hour, just head to skynews.com. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, why not give the podcast a wee follow? Should be just a click away wherever you got this one. The Daily is back again tomorrow.
You asked and we listened.
The first 100 days of Trump 2.0 is almost over, but we're not done yet.
So we're keeping the podcast going every weekday at 6 a.m.
Join us to stay up to date with the latest twists and turns.
for interviews and analysis.
And stories from across the United States.
You can listen to Sky News Trump 100 now, wherever you get your podcasts.